Welcome back. Today I'm going to be reassembling the bottom end of a Ski-Doo snowmobile engine. This is a 500cc twin cylinder. This would be the 493 series. So the assembly process on this is going to be the same as the 493, the 593, which is a 600. And actually, according to this, it's going to be the same as the 693 and 793. So 500, 600, 700, and 800 bottom ends are all the same. And actually, I would be very surprised if the 440 is any different too. But this is the 500cc 493 series Rotax twin cylinder engine. I've already prepped the crank. The crank is ready to drop in. There's IsoFlex grease in this outer bearing. That's an expensive thing to do, and honestly this is the first time I did it. That's why I didn't put it on camera, so I wasn't really sure how well it was going to work. It actually didn't go too bad, but the bearing is re-greased, everything's clean on the crank, it's in a clean spot, it's ready to go back into the bottom end here. So I'm going to go ahead, rotate this camera down, and we'll get going. Alright, so what I've got here is the lower crankcase and the upper crankcase, and I've got them up on 2x4s, and that's for when I drop the crank in, so I have a spot for the connecting rods to drop through and not bottom out, because when I reassemble it, it's going to be upside down, and I don't have the top end put together, which I really couldn't do with how far apart this engine is. So before I really get started, I'm going to loosely reassemble the oil pump and water pump drive. I've got some grease on that, on the O-rings. I've got new O-rings, and this should, the bearing, there's a bearing down inside of here that should drop right back in. Now normally I would be a little bit more concerned about getting the bearings oiled, but this entire cavity here is going to be totally filled with oil once I get this thing back together. So it just slipped back in easier than I expected. Hopefully those O-rings survived that. So I'll just take my, wherever they are, bolts. Now looking at the way this is designed, I haven't gotten this far in the service information yet. I wanted to have this reinstalled before the crank goes in, but I'm fairly certain these screws are going to take some type of sealant. I do think that these are going to take some type of sealant. They go through this coolant passage here and actually go into where I think they'll drip out if they don't have some type of sealant on them. But for right now, we'll just go ahead. We'll thread these in here so that they hold it in. I'm not going to put the impeller back on yet or anything. Could you put this back in after the crank is in? I think you probably can. So we're not going to worry about that. I didn't take it apart and do all the seals and bearings and whatnot inside of here. That still seems to work pretty good. And over on this side, I've got the block off plate, which isn't tight yet, but it's there. So again, I would normally oil these bearings, put a couple drops on, spin them around. But because this is going to legitimately just be bathed in oil up to about this level, I'm not going to worry about it for those two. They'll get plenty of oil once it gets filled up. I'm actually going to take this lower case and just set it off to the side over here, which will be totally fine for it. And then I'll bring this one up closer to where I can actually work on it a little bit. Now, for the sealant here, you want to make sure that this surface is absolutely clean. This is a finely machined surface, so they machine this surface first, and then they go ahead and machine the bores out into it. So when you are putting one of these together, this surface needs to be really clean, but you can't use any type of abrasive cleaner on it, because if you take any material off, you can screw up, one, the seal, and two, the clamp on the bearings. So what I'm going to use here is Ski-Doo specs out some Loctite, and I don't remember what the number is. I'm going to use Yamabond number 4. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead, open that up. If you didn't know that, there's a poker on the other side of these caps. That's what you use to open the sealant. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this. And I'm actually going to cut it twice. When you cut it twice at overlapping intervals, what you end up doing is creating something that is capable of putting a nice little bead down. Now, this is one crank seal. This is the other main crank seal. Down here, it's not as critical if it seals or not, but I still want it to. Whoa, that was a little runnier than I expected. So we'll start over. Now, as you're laying this out, you don't want a ton of excess. Excess sealant has a chance of getting down into the crankcase, and you don't really want that. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other case half. And I had to go all the way around these parts. That's actually where the coolant flows in the engine. Now, unfortunately, the best tool I'm going to have for this job right now is going to actually be my hand. I would rather use a brush or something like that to do this, which is what Yamabond recommends, but that's just not in the cards today. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of smear this around and try to leave a nice uniform amount on the whole surface. And I'm going to try not to get any down inside the case. So once you've got that leveled out, kind of sitting, you're supposed to let it tack off for a few minutes. Honestly, in my experience, it takes me long enough to get it where I'm flat enough and level enough with it that I don't feel too bad about it. Like right now, I'm still kind of clearing some stuff out. It takes me long enough to do that I don't worry too much about the tack off time. Like that's kind of part of me being messy with this stuff. And honestly, there's probably too much of this, and probably a little bit of it is going to smush down into the center. It is what it is at this point. So I've got both sides kind of evenly spread out to a nice thin layer. The next thing I'm going to do is pick my crankshaft up. And yep, this is the correct orientation. Now again, if you say had a crankshaft that you did not previously run, so these bearings in this particular unit are all already greased. So if you had one that you did not have that same situation with, you would want to make sure you grease all of them. The other thing you want to do is kind of watch as you're setting it in. You're going to have to roll this around. There's pins on each bearing, and those pins go into a little notch out in the top case. So as you drop it in, what I normally do is I try to get them so that all the pins are lined up, straight up when they're going down. That way I can just roll them into place, and I don't have to worry about them getting trapped into the case on the other side. So those pins are all now on this side, which would be away from your notch for the stator in that. And my seals are all set nicely into their spots. My steel retaining rings are all into their spots. So this should seal up nice and good, or nice when it's set down in. So we've got our seals all lining up where they're supposed to. All the notches are going into the spot that they're meant to go into. And there's this sealant's going to kind of squish together and seal up with the seals itself when this goes back together. So now what I'm going to do is take my top half of the case, which I left the trigger on there, so it's not, so it is what it is. I'm just going to have to keep it out of the way. Now there's 2 alignment pins here, and the other one's in the lower case, but it goes into there. So I want to get this thing lined up, and I want to drop it straight down. Okay. All my holes are lining up. My seal there is nice and tight. So now what I'll start to do is I'll just kind of press this down. And yep, like I said, I have too much sealant on it, so it's going to kind of smush out. Now, what I did do here is I did get my bolts ready to go. And by ready to go, I mean I have them lined up. Actually, I just spun it around backwards. I have them pretty much lined up in the way they came out. So I should be able to drop these all down in. And one of the ways you can kind of make sure you're getting the right ones is to drop them, and they should all stick out about the same distance from the case. So again, I skipped this step because this crank already was ready to go. It's already oiled up. But before you drop this in, you would want to make sure all your crank bearings have some oil in them already. Just so that they're ready to go as far as that goes. Start all of these by hand. So I'll just tighten these all down snug by hand. I'm not going to worry about these ones out here right now. They don't really matter that much to the overall strength of the case. And actually there's 2 that come down from the top that I'm just not going to be too concerned with yet either. Okay, so now I've got all of those run down. Just kind of snug these a little bit more. And I'm not following the torque sequence yet. I want to snug these up just a little bit. Like, really not very much. Okay, so I've got these just snugged up, and I'm actually going to flip the motor around because that's the way that the service information is laid out. And so now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'm going to torque these down to 13.5 foot-pounds. And I'm going to go in Ski-Doo's recommended sequence now. So I'm going to start up here with this one here. Oops. We'll take the extension off. Extensions throw your torques off a little bit. So we'll go ahead, take that extension off. 13.5 is going to be like nothing. Okay, now we're going to go kind of a crisscross pattern for the first 4. Now this is not a sequence I would have come up with. Most of the time in sequences I go out from the center in a circle if I don't know the pattern. So there's 5. Okay. So 5, we're going here. 6. So that means, all right. So we'll stay down on this end. Here's 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Oh, let's see here. Then we come down to the bottom, to the outer rows. 13, 14, 15, 16. Yep, and then I would go out to these two. But like I said, I'm not super worried about them right now. So now what I can do is I'm going to spin the crankshaft and just make sure that it turns. And it does. It turns over nice and easy. So no binding, nothing like that. So we're going to go ahead, crank this up to full torque, which is going to be 21 foot-pounds. Okay, same deal, same sequence. 1, 4, 5, 6. As you can see, I'm starting to have to get a little bit more creative with how I hold this engine. Okay, so now one of the things I like to do is I like to come back to the start and make sure that they held. That one didn't move at all, but I'm just going to go through the whole sequence again real quick. You don't really have to. I do recommend checking at least the first one again. Okay, so now the rest of these are actually going to get torqued, and they're only going to get torqued to 80 foot-pounds. I'm not even going to do that one on camera. You get the idea. But there's 5 bolts. So these ones back here, this third one here, and then there are 2 that come down from the top right above here. So here, I can roll it. Then the 2 that come in right here, these are all Allen. These are all 80 inch-pounds. Actually, these ones both go into here, so I'm going to put a little thread sealant on those because they go into the cooling system. Alright, so I went through and I did tighten these other 5 bolts down to the 80 inch-pounds they request. Now there's another thing that I will do here before I put the top end on, but I'm not quite there yet, and that is to use this squirt bottle that I just have simply filled with 2-stroke oil, and I will put some oil straight down this little hole here. That little hole there feeds the oiling to the mag side crank bearings. If your engine has one drilled on the other side, then it probably doesn't have the Isoflex grease in it, because some of them are drilled here and feed both bearings that way. So I'll drop a little bit of just normal 2-stroke oil down that, and that'll be it for the bottom end. Actually, that's not it for the bottom end. I'm not going to put this back on yet. And there was one other thing. So if you have an oil pump, your oil pump is going to go back on there, and you're going to need to prime that oil pump before you put it into the sled. But I am not. I'm going to premix this sled. This is going into my 440 race sled chassis. So I'm actually going to leave this totally loose. And before I put this totally back together, I'm going to dump two-stroke oil down into this cavity, and it's going to totally fill this entire area. And then it's got a little oil bottle that hooks in and goes into this line, and it legitimately totally fills this area with oil. You've got to have oil inside of here for the bearings on the water pump and the drive gear for the water pump. But that'll be totally submerged in oil, and I'm not ready to do that yet. So that'll be at the end. So there you go. That's it. This engine's back together. See, it kind of rolls over. It's all good. And yeah, that's it. So thanks for watching, and I'll have the rest of this assembly when I get parts. So legitimately, I don't have parts to finish this up yet. This is as far as it's going to go for a couple days. So I'm going to put some rags over here to keep dirt out, and this will be nice and dried up. They say this takes 60 minutes to set. It'll have probably 3 or 4 days before I see the rest of the stuff to do it. So thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you later.